The impossible mission. The skies of Novara had always been a brilliant azure, streaked with wispy clouds that danced across the horizon like celestial veils. Now they burned a sickly orange, choked with ash and the harbingers of extinction. From his observation post on the highest peak of the Meridian Range, Elder Torvald watched as another methane geyser erupted in the distance, sending plumes of toxic gas into the already poisoned atmosphere. "How long?" he asked, his 4 eyes blinking in sequence, a gesture of deep concern among his kind. Scientist Nirai checked her instruments, her slender fingers trembling slightly. 42 days until the planet's core destabilizes completely. The magnetic field is already failing. Solar radiation will make the surface uninhabitable in 30 days. Torvald's secondary heart constricted painfully. Novara had been home to his people for 12 generations, ever since the Great Migration from their dying homeworld. Now history was repeating itself, but this time there would be no escape. The Novaran people had constructed massive underground shelters, but they would only delay the inevitable. Without a fleet of their own, the 8 million Novarans were trapped. The transmission was received by the Terran Council, he asked, though he already knew the answer. 6 months ago, Nirai confirmed. "We've heard nothing. The distance is too great. Even if they responded immediately, no rescue fleet could reach us in time." The elder turned his gaze upward, beyond the poisoned sky to the stars that would soon be their only witnesses. "Then we prepare for the end with dignity." As if in defiant answer to his resignation, a series of bright flashes appeared in the upper atmosphere. Neri's instruments erupted with activity. "Ships," she gasped. 12 vessels of unknown configuration entering orbit. Before Torvald could respond, the communication array he carried emitted a sound it hadn't made in years, the signal for an incoming transmission. A voice, unmistakably human, filled the observation post. "Novaran authorities, this is Captain Ilara Chen of the Earth Expeditionary Force. We received your distress call. We're here to help." Torvald and Nirai exchanged looks of disbelief. The humans had come, but 12 ships, for 8 million people. It was almost worse than no response at all. Captain Ilara Chen knew what the Novarans were thinking before they said it. She thought the same thing when she received her orders from Earth Command. 12 ships, Admiral. "There are 8 million civilians on that planet," she had protested. Admiral Kato had fixed her with a steady gaze. "It's all we have in range that can reach them before the catastrophe. The main evacuation fleet won't arrive for another 8 months, by which time the planet will be a molten ball of rock." Ilara had finished for him. "Your mission isn't to evacuate them all, Captain. It's to keep as many alive as possible until the main fleet arrives." Now, standing in the Novaran Council chamber, Ilara faced the same incredulity from Elder Torvald and his fellow leaders. "You offer us hope we cannot afford to embrace," Torvald said, his voice a low rumble that filled the chamber. "Your 12 ships cannot carry even a fraction of our population." Ilara stepped forward, her short, muscular frame dwarfed by the tall, willowy Novarans. "We didn't come to take your people away. Not yet. We came to buy time." She activated a holographic display that showed Novara's core, the spreading instability, and the projected timeline. "Our science vessels have analyzed your planet's condition. We can't stop the core degradation, but we believe we can delay the collapse of your magnetic field by establishing a network of field generators in low orbit." "How would this help?" asked Nirai, who had been invited to the council as their chief scientist. Ilara nodded to her chief engineer, who stepped forward. Commander Ibrahim Nasir was a tall, thin man with dark skin and quick, precise movements. "The generators will create an artificial magnetic bubble. It won't be as strong as your natural field, but it will reduce radiation exposure by roughly 70%. That buys us an additional 60 days. Hope flickered in the council chamber, but Torvald remained skeptical. "Even with this extension, your main fleet will arrive too late." "That's why we brought these," Ilara said, displaying another hologram. Cryogenic survival pods. Our cargo ships are filled with them. We can put up to 4 million of your people into suspended animation, deep in your underground shelters where they'll be protected from the worst of the geological activity. Murmurs spread through the chamber. 4 million was only half their population, but it was far better than nothing. And the rest? Torvald asked, voicing the question everyone was afraid to ask. Ilara met his 4 eyes steadily. We keep them alive as long as possible, in rotating shifts in the deepest shelters. We'll need volunteers to remain awake to maintain the pods and prepare for evacuation when our main fleet arrives. You're asking half our population to die so the other half might live, one of the council members said, her voice thin with emotion. No, Ilara replied firmly. I'm asking for a chance to save everyone. But we need to start now. After hours of debate, the Novaran Council made their decision. They would accept the humans' help, desperate as it was. What choice did they have? The next weeks passed in a blur of frenetic activity. The humans worked alongside Novaran engineers to deploy the magnetic field generators. Commander Nasir's team modified the generators to draw power from Novara's frequent electrical storms, a resource the Novarans had never fully harnessed. Meanwhile, Dr. Maya Williams, the expedition's chief medical officer, worked with Novaran healers to prepare their people for cryogenic suspension, a technology the Novarans had never developed. Your physiology is fascinating, Maya told her Novaran counterpart, a healer named Varish. The dual cardiovascular system actually makes you better candidates for cryosuspension than humans. That is fortunate, Varish replied, her voice melodic despite her concern. But I worry about the psychological impact. Our people have strong communal bonds. The idea of half our population sleeping while the others remain awake to possibly perish. Maya placed a gentle hand on Varish's slender arm. That's why we're prioritizing family units. Either all members sleep or all stay awake. In the central plaza of the capital city, Captain Chen had established an operations center. She was coordinating with the Novaran authorities on the selection process for the cryogenic pods when a violent tremor shook the ground. It was the 5th that day, and by far the strongest. Status report. She called out as she steadied herself against a console. Geological instability is increasing faster than projected, reported Lieutenant Kai Rodriguez, her science officer. His youthful face was drawn with fatigue. None of the human crew had slept more than a few hours at a stretch since their arrival. The core degradation is accelerating. How much time have we lost? Ilara asked, already dreading the answer. At least 2 weeks, maybe more. The first magnetic field generator will be online in 36 hours, but I don't know if that'll be soon enough to make a difference. Ilara felt the weight of 8 million lives pressing down on her shoulders. She'd known this mission was nearly impossible from the start, but now the thin margin they'd been counting on was vanishing. We continue as planned, she decided, but accelerate the cryogenic preparation. I want the first 100,000 pods ready for occupation in 48 hours. As she issued the order, another tremor struck, worse than the last. The operations center's ceiling cracked, and pieces of masonry crashed down around them. Ilara shoved Lieutenant Rodriguez clear of a falling support beam, but couldn't move quickly enough herself. The beam struck her shoulder, dragging her to the ground. Through a haze of pain, she heard shouts and felt hands lifting the weight off her. Novaran voices mixed with human ones in shared concern. I'm fine, she insisted as Maya rushed to her side with a medical scanner. Fractured clavicle and scapula, Maya reported grimly. You need medical attention, Captain. Later, Ilara said, gritting her teeth as she stood. We have work to do. Outside the operations center, a new nightmare was unfolding. The tremors had triggered a chain reaction in Novara's unstable crust. Massive fissures were opening throughout the city, venting toxic gases from below. The Novaran evacuation to the deep shelters, planned to unfold over weeks, would now have to happen in days. As Ilara limped to the doorway, She saw Elder Torvald organizing his people with remarkable efficiency, directing them to gathering points where human shuttles waited to transport them to the shelters in the mountains. "Your injury does not slow you," he observed as she approached. "Neither does your planet's attempt to kill us ahead of schedule," she replied with grim humor. A ghost of a smile flickered across Torvald's alien features. "Perhaps we have more in common than I first thought, Captain Chen." Before she could respond, Commander Nasir rushed up to them, his face ashen. "Captain, we have a problem. The main cargo vessel containing 60% of the cryopods, it's been damaged by the tremors. The landing struts collapsed. The ship is sinking into a fissure." Ilara felt ice form in her veins. If they lost those pods, they lost any hope of saving even half the population. "Options," she demanded. "We're attempting to stabilize the ship, but the ground is too unstable. We need to offload the pods immediately, but we don't have enough transport capacity." Torvald stepped forward. "My people can help. We have mining crawlers designed for unstable terrain." "They're not rated for the weight of the cryopods," Nasser objected. "Then we will carry them by hand if necessary," Torvald declared. "Show us what must be done." The next 18 hours were a desperate race against time. Humans and Novarans worked side by side, forming chains to move thousands of cryopods from the sinking ship to safer ground. Many of the pods had to be manually carried through terrain too unstable for vehicles. Novaran workers, with their greater height and strength, bore the brunt of this labor. Captain Chen, despite her injury, refused to leave the site until the last pod was secured. As the final units were being moved, a violent tremor, worse than any before, struck without warning. The cargo ship, now empty of its precious cargo, groaned and slid further into the widening fissure. The ground beneath the rescue workers began to crack. "Fall back," Ilara shouted. "Everyone fall back now." In the chaos that followed, humans and Novarans scrambled for safety. Most made it clear, but a section of ground collapsed, taking 3 Novarans and one of Ilara's crew with it. Without hesitation, Torvald and Ilara rushed to the edge of the new chasm. 20 feet below, the victims clung to outcroppings, the glow of magma visible far beneath them. "Rope," Ilara called out. "We need rope or cable." "No time," Torvald said. Then, to Ilara's astonishment, he lay flat at the edge of the chasm and extended his long body downward. "I can reach them, but I cannot pull them up alone." Understanding immediately, Ilara grabbed Torvald's ankles, ignoring the screaming pain in her shoulder. "Do it." One by one, Torvald reached the stranded survivors, and with Ilara anchoring him, they were able to pull them to safety. As the last survivor, a young Novaran female, was being lifted, the ground shifted again. Ilara felt her footing slip, and for a heart-stopping moment, she thought they would all plunge into the abyss. Then strong hands gripped her from behind, dozens of them, human and Novaran alike, forming a living chain to pull them all to solid ground. As they lay recovering, Ilara met Torvald's four-eyed gaze. "Thank you," she said simply. "No, Captain," he replied. "Thank you for coming when no one else would, for believing this was possible when logic said it was not." Around them, the poisoned sky of Novara darkened with the approaching night, and in the distance, new fissures glowed with the light of the planet's dying core. The mission had just suffered its first major setback, and the worst was yet to come. But looking at the seamless cooperation between her crew and the Novarans, Ilara felt something she hadn't expected to find on this doomed world. Hope. Defiance against fate. The command center in Shelter Alpha had been designed for efficiency rather than comfort. Buried 3 miles beneath the Meridian Mountains, it was the nerve center for humanity's desperate attempt to save the Novaran civilization. Captain Ilara Chen studied the holographic display with burning eyes. She'd been awake for nearly 40 hours, sustained only by stims and determination. "Status report," she said to the room at large. Cryogenic suspension process is at 73% completion, reported Dr. Maya Williams. Her normally immaculate appearance had given way to disheveled hair and a stained uniform. 3.1 million Novarans are now in stable suspension. Geological stability. Ilara asked, turning to Lieutenant Rodriguez. The young science officer shook his head. The magnetic field generators are online, but core degradation continues to accelerate. We've lost another 5 days from our timeline. The deep shelters. Ilara pressed on, refusing to let despair take hold. Shelter Alpha through Delta are at capacity, Commander Nasir reported. Echo and Foxtrot are at 84%. The remaining population is still being transported from the surface. Not fast enough, Ilara muttered. She turned to the Novaran representatives. Elder Torval had insisted on remaining among the awake population, coordinating his people's efforts alongside the humans. The evacuation of the western continent is being hampered by the liquefaction of the lowlands, Torval said grimly. Many are trapped by newly formed lakes of superheated mud. We've diverted all available shuttles, Ilara assured him. But we're limited by atmospheric conditions. The turbulence is beyond safe operational parameters. My people are dying while we speak of parameters, said Counselor Jurek, the most outspoken critic of the human intervention. Your promises ring hollow, Captain. Ilara understood his anger. The plan had been desperate from the start, and now even that slim hope was fading. What about the deep-sea haulers? Suggested Lieutenant Sofia Mendez, one of the younger officers who had been quiet until now. All eyes turned to her. The magnetic disruption makes them unreliable for precision work, Commander Nasir objected. Yes, for precision work, Sofia agreed. But what if we're not trying to be precise? The haulers have reinforced hulls designed to withstand deep-sea pressures. They could traverse the mudflats. Ilara's exhausted mind lashed onto the idea. They're not atmospheric craft. No, but they're sealed environments with their own life support. If we strip them down, removed non-essential components to reduce weight, they could function as crude transport vessels. Torval finished, his 4 eyes widening as he grasped the concept. Ungainly, but effective. It's reckless, objected Nasir. It's necessary, Ilara countered. Lieutenant Mendez, you have command of this operation. Take whatever personnel and resources you need. Sofia nodded, already moving toward the exit. I'll need Novaran engineers. They know the terrain better than we do. You shall have them, Torval promised. As they departed, Ilara allowed herself one deep breath, the first moment of relief she'd felt in days. It will buy us time, she told Nasir quietly. But we're still losing ground against the core degradation. Find me solutions, Commander. Find me a way to save more of these people. The modified deep-sea haulers proved more effective than anyone had dared hope. Converted into lumbering transport vehicles, they rescued thousands of stranded Novarans from the Western Territories. But nature continued to work against them. A massive seismic event collapsed the entrance to shelter Foxtrot, rendering it inaccessible and forcing a redistribution of the remaining refugees. 20 days into the mission, with the surface now bathed in lethal radiation, despite the orbital shield generators, Captain Chen called an emergency meeting of her senior staff and the Novaran leadership. We've reached a critical juncture, she began without preamble. The main evac fleet has reported in. They've pushed their engines beyond safe limits, but they won't arrive for another 130 days. Our projection for planetary habitability, even with the shield generators, is 93 days. A heavy silence fell over the assembled leaders. How large is the gap in cryogenic capacity? Torval asked. With the losses we've sustained, we can place another 500,000 in suspension, Maya answered. That leaves approximately 900,000 Novarans who will have to remain awake through the worst of it. The radiation shielding in the deepest levels of Shelter Alpha might keep them alive, Lieutenant Rodriguez offered, but life support systems would be strained beyond capacity. And if there's a failure, he didn't need to finish the thought. If life support failed, It would doom not only the active population, but the suspended one as well. "There is another option," said a new voice. All heads turned to see Chief Engineer Pavel Volkov, who had been working with the Novaran technical teams. "But it would require sacrifice from both our peoples." Ilara gestured for him to continue. "The human ships in orbit. If we strip them down to their essential components and bring them to the surface, we could use their environmental systems to supplement the shelters. It would extend life support capacity by approximately 40%. Enough to sustain the remaining population?" Ilara asked. "Possibly. But it would mean stranding every human on this planet until the main fleet arrives. And even then, it's not certain we would survive." The implications were clear. The 12 human ships represented their only guarantee of personal survival. If the main fleet was delayed, or if Novara's deterioration accelerated further, the human rescuers would die alongside the people they had come to save. "How long would the dismantling take?" Ilara asked, her voice steady. 3 days to bring the components down. Another 5 to integrate them with the shelter systems. Ilara looked at her crew, seeing the mixture of fear and determination on their faces. Then she turned to the Novaran representatives. "We came here knowing this might be a one-way trip," she said simply. "The ships come down. Prepare your teams, Chief Volkov." As the meeting dispersed, Counselor Jurek approached Ilara. The Novaran, who had been most critical of the humans' efforts, looked at her with new eyes. "My people have a saying," he said. "The measure of a civilization is not what it builds, but what it will sacrifice to preserve the lives of others. I misjudged yours, Captain Chen." Ilara nodded in acknowledgement. "We're not done yet, Counselor. We still have to make this work." The dismantling of the human fleet proceeded with grim efficiency. Essential components were brought down on the remaining shuttles, while the stripped hulls were placed in stable orbit as monuments to the mission. The Novaran engineers worked alongside the humans to integrate the new systems, learning human technology with remarkable speed. But on the 4th day of integration, disaster struck. A power surge, caused by an unexpected interaction between human and Novaran technology, triggered an explosion in Shelter Alpha's main power distribution center. 3 humans and 7 Novarans died instantly. Worse, the life support systems for an entire section of the cryobay were compromised. Dr. Williams rushed to assess the damage, returning to the command center with a haggard expression. "We've lost power to Cryosector 7. Backup systems are engaged, but they'll only last 48 hours. We need to reroute main power before then." "How many pods in that sector?" Ilara asked. 200,000. The number hung in the air like a physical weight. 200,000 lives, suspended between life and death, now depending on a repair that might be impossible in the time available. "The conduits were damaged in the explosion," Chief Volkov explained. "We'd need to physically replace them. But the junction is in an area now flooded with radiation from a crack in the outer shell." "Remote operation," suggested Commander Nasir. "We tried. The radiation is interfering with the controls." "Then someone has to go in manually," Ilara concluded. "The radiation levels would be fatal within minutes," Maya objected, "even with our best suits." All eyes turned to Torval, who had been conferring quietly with a Novaran engineer. The elder stepped forward. "My people have greater radiation resistance than yours," he said. "But even for us, this would be a fatal exposure." "No," Ilara said firmly. "We'll find another way." "There is no other way," Torval replied gently. "And we have already established a principle, have we not? The measure of a civilization is what it will sacrifice." Before anyone could stop him, he turned and strode from the command center. Ilara moved to follow, but was stopped by Counselor Jurek's hand on her arm. "Let him go, Captain. He has made his choice, as you made yours when you brought your ships down." Helpless, Ilara watched on the monitors as Torval and 3 Novaran engineers entered the damaged section. They worked with incredible speed, their slender fingers deftly replacing the ruptured conduits. After 37 minutes, far longer than any human could have survived. The power levels to Cryosector 7 stabilized. The Novarans emerged from the radioactive zone, already showing signs of acute radiation poisoning. Their skin, normally a pale blue, had darkened to an angry purple. They were rushed to the medical bay, but everyone knew it was merely to ease their passing. In his final hours, Torvald asked to speak with Ilara alone. "Do not mourn us," he told her, his voice barely above a whisper. "We die so that others may live. It is the highest purpose one can serve. Your sacrifice will be remembered," Ilara promised, fighting back tears. "Remember instead what we have learned from each other," Torvald said. "When your people first arrived with only 12 ships, I thought you were offering a cruel joke of hope. Now I understand. You never intended to save us with your ships. You came to save us with your spirit. Your refusal to accept defeat even when logic says it is inevitable." He reached out with a trembling hand, and Ilara took it gently. "My people will carry this lesson to the stars," he continued. "That when faced with extinction, it was not technology that saved us, but determination. Human determination." Torvald died hours later, along with the engineers who had accompanied him. They were given heroes' funerals according to Novaran tradition. Their bodies returned to the planet's core through a sacred shaft. The days that followed brought new challenges, but also unexpected blessings. The core degradation, which had been accelerating, suddenly stabilized. Lieutenant Rodriguez theorized that the recent seismic events had released pressure that had been building for centuries. "It won't save the planet," he explained, "but it buys us another 30 days. Maybe more." Those 30 days proved crucial. The integrated life support systems functioned better than anticipated, and the remaining Novaran population adapted to the cramped conditions with remarkable resilience. When the first ships of the main evacuation fleet appeared in orbit, 20 days ahead of schedule thanks to advances in engine technology developed after the initial mission had launched, the situation on Novara was stable. The evacuation proceeded methodically. The cryopods were transferred first, then the awake population. The human rescuers insisted on being the last to leave, maintaining the systems until the final Novaran was safely aboard the fleet. 112 days after the arrival of Captain Chen's desperate mission, the last shuttle lifted off from Novara's surface. From orbit, they watched as the dying planet entered its final phase, the crust breaking apart to reveal the molten core beneath. It was both terrifying and beautiful, a funeral pyre for a world that had nurtured the Novaran civilization for generations. On the main evacuation vessel, a ceremony was held to honor those who had made the rescue possible. The human crew of the original 12 ships were given Novaran life tokens, crystalline structures that contained genetic material from Novaran donors, symbolizing that they were now considered part of the Novaran family lineage. Captain Ilara Chen, her arm still in a sling from her original injury, accepted her token from Counselor Jarek, who had become the de facto leader of the Novaran people after Torvald's death. "We once believed that 12 ships could not save a world," Jarek announced to the assembled crowd. "The humans proved us wrong. Not because their ships could carry us all, but because their courage inspired us to save ourselves." He gestured to a large viewport, where Novara's final moments played out against the blackness of space. "We have lost our world, but we have gained something perhaps more valuable, an unbreakable bond with humanity. Together, our two species have defied the very laws of nature that said we must perish. Together, we will find a new home and build a new future." Later, alone in her quarters aboard the evacuation vessel, Ilara held her life token to the light, watching as it captured and refracted the starlight in patterns of incomparable beauty. In its depths, she could almost see Torvald's wise eyes and the faces of all those, human and Novaran alike, who had given everything to ensure that a civilization would endure. The mission that had seemed impossible, the desperate gamble with only 12 ships against overwhelming odds, had succeeded not through technological superiority or military might, but through the simplest and most powerful of human traits, the absolute refusal to leave anyone behind. As Novara gave up its final breath in a spectacular display of cosmic fire, a new chapter was beginning, one written by two species who had learned that together they could defy the very stars themselves.